Xenosaga games are the awkward middle child of the Xenosaga games. Caught between the popularity of its more successful predecessors, Xenogears, and successors, Xenoblades, a lot of people are left not knowing the complicated story of the Xenosaga series. Even the people that have played it tend to be very confused about the story because it involves a lot of philosophical, sci-fi themes that delve into multiple universes and quantum physics and all that other stuff. This is why I want to try to explain it. It's a fascinating, deep story that spans thousands of years and deals with things like the creation of the universe, different dimensions, and the ethics of androids and AI as a new form of life. So without further ado, let's begin. Chapter 1. In the Beginning. The beginning of the Xenosaga story begins in the beginning, the first beginning, the Big Bang. The Big Bang created the multi-dimensional universe that the Xenosaga series takes place in. Within this universe is the lower domain and the upper domain. The lower domain is essentially the dimension we exist in, while the upper domain is a higher dimension that we don't know much about. All we know about the upper domain is that it is where a wave consciousness called Udu lives. It is possible, but not certain, that Udu is all that exists in the upper domain. Udu is seen as the true god of the Xenosaga universe, but more accurately, it is the collective will of the universe. Because of all this, the upper domain should not be seen as some sort of parallel universe. It's a dimension completely separate from ours with different rules. It is seen as a domain of God, and Udu itself is seen by some as God. The lower domain, however, has two different domains, or dimensions, of its own. These would be closer to being parallel dimensions, but still not quite. Let's call these subdomains. The first subdomain of the lower domain is called the real number domain. It is a domain we humans inhabit, a domain of physical matter. The other subdomain is called the imaginary number domain. This is the domain of consciousness. Here physical things don't exist, and the consciousness or souls of all sentient beings in the real number domain live here. This could essentially be seen as the spirit world. Despite the fact that the consciousness of humans exists in the imaginary number domain, the consciousness of humans still have a kind of connection with their physical forms in the real number domain. However, when something dies in the real number domain, their consciousness, now lacking a physical form in the real number domain, join the collective unconscious, aka the Unus Mundus. The Unus Mundus is a place in the imaginary number domain of the lower domain, where all consciousness of humans who have died go. However, because of humans' individuality, some consciousness reject this assimilation of consciousness and don't go into the Unus Mundus. These consciousness are known as gnosis. Refusing to join with the Unus Mundus, they inhabit the imaginary number domain. I've been saying imaginary domain, haven't I? Over time, the imaginary number domain overflows with gnosis, thanks to this process of rejecting the Unus Mundus. When this happens, the imaginary number domain collapses, and when the imaginary number domain collapses, the whole lower domain collapses, which makes the upper domain collapse. This in turn means that if the imaginary number domain were to ever overflow with gnosis and collapse, the whole universe would collapse. This is where our first real character comes in, Wilhelm. As far as we know, Wilhelm was born at the moment the universe came into being, or soon after. He was created by the Unus Mundus as a way to protect the lower domain. He is immortal and does not age. His role is protector of the lower domain. And this might make him sound like a good guy, but really he's neither good or bad. His sole purpose of existing is to prevent the lower domain from collapsing by any means necessary. The way he goes about this is with a process called eternal recurrence. I'll go more into detail as to what this process entails, but to sum it up, eternal recurrence is a process in which Wilhelm restarts time in the lower domain and takes it back to the beginning of everything. This prevents it from ever collapsing, but it also prevents it from ever getting past a certain point. Because of this, our dimension, the lower domain, is doomed to forever repeat itself in a never-ending cycle. It is implied that Wilhelm has already done this multiple times before the time of the first Xenosaga game. However, as he himself is part of the lower domain, his memories of this process are also lost when the universe restarts. Because of this, after every cycle, he has to regather all the information and tools that are necessary for eternal recurrence. To aid him in his role after every recurrence of the universe, he uses the Compass of Chaos and Order, which is an artifact that is pretty much part of him. The Compass of Chaos and Order is actually Wilhelm's manifested ability to predict all possible futures. Because of this, he's had it since the beginning of time, and he uses it to help him guide humanity from behind the scenes. Because of this, it is possible that he is somewhat omniscient. Keep in mind that eternal recurrence only restarts the lower domain. This means that the upper domain is never reset, and Udu, who lives in the upper domain and observes the lower domain, has seen this process of eternal recurrence multiple times. The reasons why Udu observes the lower domain is simply to learn about us. It's much like a human would look into a microscope to learn about microscopic beings. He wants to learn about the consciousness that reject each other and reject the Unus Mundus. And he wants to learn about humans and their complex emotions and feelings. He wants to learn why the destruction of the universe is connected to the imaginary number domain. And he just essentially wants to learn everything about the beings inhabiting the lower domain. Another thing that was created the moment the Big Bang happened was the Zohar. The Zohar is a gateway between the upper and the lower domain. Through the Zohar, Udu can be contacted, and the waves emanating from Udu can be used as an infinite source of energy. Because of this, many people see the Zohar itself as a source of energy, although it is much more than that. The golden monolith that we see is simply how the Zohar manifests itself in our plane of existence, but it is actually just a gateway from the lower domain to the upper domain. Chapter 2: The Time of the Messiah. Fast forward to the year 722 BC. This is around the time that Jesus Christ, the Messiah, was born. Much of what's true about the Jesus in the real-world Christian religion is true for the Xenosaga version of Jesus. He was born on earth in Bethlehem to his mother Mary and adopted father Joseph. Jesus preached about a way for humanity to ascend to the upper domain. Among his disciples were his partner Mary Magdalene, Mary's maiden, and Yeshua, who was Jesus' closest friend and served as Jesus' proxy and miracle worker, since Jesus, in the Xenosaga universe, was an ordinary man. Yeshua and Mary Magdalene are the actualizations in the real number domain of the powers of anima and animus, which came from the collective unconscious. They placed their bodies into the human world and worked as Jesus' disciples. The power of anima, Yeshua, and the power of animus, Mary, are kind of hard to understand, but they are essentially two parts of the same coin. The power of anima is a failsafe for the universe. If the lower domain is on the verge of collapse because of the gnosis overflowing the imaginary number domain, Yeshua's power of anima would activate and destroy the lower domain before it can collapse. This would prevent the upper domain from collapsing, although it would doom the lower domain. This is why he is considered to be the failsafe of the universe. This puts him at odds with Wilhelm, whose reason of existing is to protect the lower domain at all costs. The power of animus is able to control the power of anima itself, as well as controlling the relics of God, which we will get into later. Animus is a necessary part of the universal failsafe function, and is also at the core of the eternal recurrence function. This, however, does not make either of them evil, as the failsafe part of their power is somewhat beyond their control. So much so that Mary later sacrifices herself to slow down the power of anima, but again, more on that later. Both Mary and Yeshua are immortal and appeared on earth around the same time of Jesus in their current age, meaning they were never children and will never age. Yeshua, and presumably Mary, possess the power of teleportation and the power to be in the vacuum of space, and probably many other abilities that make him and her much more than a simple human. Presumably, Jesus and his disciples wanted to ascend to the upper domain in order to save humanity when Yeshua's power of anima destroys the lower domain. For this purpose, Mary created one of the so-called relics of God, Zarathustra. In order to power the Zarathustra, Yeshua created Lemegeton. Lemegeton is a wavelength energy that can access the Zohar in order to contact Udu, By contacting Udu, one can harness Udu's energy. In the real number domain, Lemegeton manifests as words that only Yeshua can understand and read. With Lemegeton, the followers of Jesus harnessed energy from Udu, and with this energy, along with the power of Anima, they activated Zarathustra. God, I hate saying that word. Zarathustra, in order to ascend to the upper domain. However, Udu prevented them from doing so. Because their ideology was so fatalistic when it came to the destruction of the lower domain, Jesus and his followers were at odds with Wilhelm, who was in a position of power during this time, most likely an emperor of Rome, but this is speculation. And thus, Wilhelm puppeteered the events that led to the crucifixion of Jesus and death of Jesus Christ, and persecuted his followers and followers of the belief that Jesus' crucifixion created, namely Christianity. Due to the wills, by the way, the word will and consciousness is commonly used in Xenosaga as another word for soul. Due to the wills of humans directly acting on the power of Anima, and because of Yeshua's constant use of it, the failsafe function began accelerating. In order to save the universe from dissipation, Mary split Yeshua's power of Anima in 12 pieces. These 12 pieces manifested themselves as the vessels of Anima. This act, however, caused Mary to lose her power of Animus and to begin slowly dying. Before she died, though, her maiden died. Having lost her power, she was helpless to do anything about it, and she held her in her arms as she died. Sometime later, Mary died, and her will, or soul, dissipated and fragmented into the collective unconscious. Yeshua and the remaining disciples hid the vessels of Anima and Mary's body in a place called René-le-Château, in order to prevent Wilhelm from finding them. They then hid the Zohar and Lemegeton in Kenya at the bottom of Lake Turkana. Sometime after the death of Jesus, Wilhelm secretly created the religion Ormus, which was like a corruption of Christianity, in order to further help him to manipulate humanity according to his agenda. Ormus had two faces. The public face, which has a different name that is never mentioned in the game, but one can speculate it is the religion we know as Christianity. This is the face that the public knows, and whose official goal is to convey the existence of Jesus. Then there is the private face and its more honest face. This face can be seen almost as a secret society, so much so that only the people that are part of this secret society know of the name Ormus. The goal of the secret face, and in turn the real goal of Ormus, is to manage the words of God, also known as Lemegeton, and to find and protect the artifacts of God, Zohar and Zarathustra. All of Yeshua's miracles were attributed to Jesus, and this is why he was seen as a holy man in their religion. Essentially, Yeshua was erased from the stories of their religion. In order to remain incognito, however, Wilhelm does not assume the role of the head of Ormus. Instead, different people throughout the years become the head, or patriarch, of Ormus. However, Wilhelm is always in the background manipulating Ormus and thus manipulating the followers of Ormus. At some point after Mary's death, Yeshua changes his name to Chaos, and Wilhelm obtains this Zarathustra and programs it with a new purpose. This new purpose would be the eternal recurrence mentioned in the beginning, the restarting of time in the lower domain in order to stop its destruction. Now all he needs is the tools that will let him activate Zarathustra, namely Lemegeton, the Zohar, the powers of Anima, and the activation key for Zarathustra, which is a crystal possessed by Mary's maiden. This would mean that after every restart, everything would happen exactly as it did the last time. So there would be no hope of any cycle ever going about a different way, except for one thing. Wilhelm, like I said before, can only restart the timeline of the lower domain. However, Udu is in the upper domain, and Udu, being the curious being that it is always making contact with humans and their wills in order to learn more about them. This contact tends to affect humans and their wills in different ways, mainly negative ones. But the point is that in the constant that is the lower domain's timeline, Udu is a variable in the equation that always returns a slightly different result.